At this point, there's more that I've said about Half Life Alyx than not. Besides Skyrim VR, it's the VR title that I've poured the most hours into. I've lost track of the amount of times I've bought a new VR game, loaded up Steam VR, and found myself launching Alyx again. I'm usually not one for replaying linear games. I've played through The Last of Us twice, one of my playthroughs actually consisting of a straight shot through the campaign 13 hours straight, but normally I treat linear games like long movies. Sometimes, if a movie's good enough, I'll watch it again within a year of my first viewing, but I have such a backlog of movies and, in turn, linear games that I rarely, if ever, return to linear games after completing them the first time. Half Life Alyx is the exception to this practice. I can't help coming back, even when half of my 76 titles on Steam are VR titles. I have multiple VR games that I either haven't downloaded or haven't even started. The problem, if you could even call it a problem, is that Half Life Alyx is the successor to one of the most innovative and influential games of all time, Half Life 2. When I say Alyx is the successor to Half Life 2, I'm not just referencing the fact that it's the next entry in the Half Life series. I'm referring to the fact that Half Life Alyx has done the same thing for VR that Half Life 2 did for flat screen games. Half Life 2 was innovative to the core. There's really nothing I could say about it that hasn't been said before. It was way ahead of its time, and it paved the way for hundreds of games by laying the groundwork for what makes a good game. Great story, gameplay, AI, voice acting, all of these factors made Half-Life 2 the powerhouse it was. Half-Life Alyx came along and did the same for VR. Like Half-Life 2, Half-Life Alyx wasn't the first game to incorporate the aspects of the game that make them so good, but they were the titles that perfected them. VR devs understood pretty early on that bending over and reaching long distances isn't something that all VR players are capable of, either due to physical limitations or limited play areas. Because of this, plenty of games have telekinesis in one form or another. Some games implemented this ability to teleport things to your hand better than others, but they all lacked the tactile and physical feedback that Alyx came along and provided. The gravity gloves were the answer to a question that many thought was already answered. And I, for one, am both grateful and annoyed that Valve had to one-up every other VR game's solution to the problem of getting an item from point A to point B. I'm annoyed with the gravity gloves because much like other aspects of Half-Life Alyx, other games pale in comparison to Valve's innovation. Something else that Valve ruined for me in nearly every other game is the way they handled the gunplay problem other developers have been struggling with. Admittedly, this aspect of the game can be seen as Valve's weakest offering. I mean, no two-handed weapon? And such a limited selection. What was Valve thinking? I'll tell you what they were thinking. After my first playthrough of the game, and once I started looking at the game critically, it became increasingly clear that Valve had analyzed and developed every aspect of Half-Life Alyx with playtesters' input from the get-go. Every mechanic in the game is polished to the max, and gunplay is proof of that claim. While plenty of games have implemented two-handed guns, and a good amount of them have done so with success, the lack of physical feedback when handling or firing the weapon can become distracting, and a little too gamey at times. An example of this can be found in Pavlov. I love the way Pavlov's guns feel and have put quite a few hours into the game. The gunplay suits the run and gun action that Pavlov offers its players, but it wouldn't fit into Alyx's world or pace. One-handed weapons already have recoil that ignore your hand's real-world positions, and two-handed weapons are even worse offenders. This leads to a disconnect that isn't often noticed in a multiplayer shooter, but it would pull the players out of the world the developers had worked so diligently to build up. One-handed weapons tend to have less recoil, which means less of a disconnect between what the player feels and what the game shows. Each weapon is balanced, not necessarily regarding damage statistics or ammo capacity, but regarding their size and weight distribution. The shotgun, the beefiest weapon in the game, has just as much mass protruding over the hand towards the player's wrist as it does jutting towards the zombies or combine soldiers you plan to turn into a fine red mist. Coming from Half-Life 2, the arsenal Alyx offers to the player may seem underwhelming. While it may seem disappointing at first when you consider every weapon that was lost in the transition from pancake Half-Life titles to VR, in a way, it makes perfect sense to keep the weapon selection limited, because it allows players to get comfortable and familiar with each weapon in turn, and keeps the player from falling into the all too familiar trap of sticking to a single weapon and neglecting the rest of their arsenal because it does everything the player needs it to do. Just about the time you wish the game would give you a weapon that packs more of a punch, Alyx, and in turn the player, stumble on a shotgun, just asking to help the undead get rid of the un. The developers over at Valve knew what gunplay felt right in VR, and I'm glad they ended up making the decisions they made. Something else Half-Life Alyx managed to improve on and in turn master that other VR titles have dealt with for years now was physical interactions. While Alyx is missing melee combat in really any form, besides bonking a zombie on the head with a barrel every once in a while, it makes sense why the game devs didn't include it. It's just not possible to make any form of melee combat feel realistic at this point in VR's development. The lack of physical feedback when, say, smacking a zombie with a crowbar or clashing a sword against an enemy's shield is simply too immersion breaking and janky. Melee combat works in games with different rules, like Blade and Sorcery and Boneworks. But with those games, the developers ask the player to suspend their disbelief and enjoy the experience presented to them, and in those cases it works. I still love opening a can of whip-ass on a few poor, mindless virtual nights every once in a while, and few things feel as badass as stabbing a Whole Foods brand head crab as it tries to stick to my face and fling it away. But melee combat simply wouldn't fit into the polished physical interactions found in Half-Life Alyx, and that's okay. The developers must have poured the time and resources saved on crafting a melee system in Alyx into the physics system surrounding the hundreds of props found lying around each level. Boneworks is a close contender when it comes to which VR game handles virtual interactions best, but Half-Life Alyx pulls ahead by a few hairs. For one thing, the devs at Valve figured out how to make throwing in VR feel right. Too many VR games see the player throwing a world record fastball in real life just for the object they tried to make go from here to there simply stay here. The amount of times I thought I'd thrown an absolute piss missile in games like Blade and Sorcery or Pavlov just to see my spear or flash grenade land a few feet in front of me is staggering, and every time it happens I feel a wave of disappointment wash over me. Disappointed! Throwing in Alyx, however, feels just right. And don't even get me started on the way the physics engine handles picking up items, finding a nice full shelf full of other items, and knocking them all to the floor like a cat left to its own devices. The developers knew what they were doing when they filled every shelf to the brim with random clutter, and they were setting players up for success by managing to figure out how to keep objects in containers without them spazzing out and phasing through whatever they tried to stick them in. Well, mostly. One of the most underrated aspects of VR games, at least in my opinion, is animation work. Obviously, the developers of VR games have a hard time creating animations for hands that are controlled by the player. Reloading is up to the player, and the developers can't control whether or not the player knows what they're doing. One of my favorite ways to reload in Pavlov is bringing the gun to the magazine, and the reactions I get when doing so are rarely disappointing. Valve knew that the creativity in reloads was up to the player, so they refined and perfected the only aspect of handling weapons that they could without taking control away from the player: weapon animations. Don't get me wrong, games like Onward and Pavlov handle weapon animations well, and sometimes even exceptionally. But compared to Alyx's weapons, other VR games simply disappoint. Valve made the weapons in the player's arsenal feel real, and they did so by making them feel smooth, responsive, and personal. There are plenty of other ways Half-Life Alyx exceeded the standards set by the industry, but if I gushed over each and every one of them in this video, it would go on for hours. From sound design to texture work, Alyx presents an experience so perfect, so polished, that showing the game to the uninitiated will undoubtedly sow the seeds of the idea that VR isn't a gimmick at the very least, and convince the first-time player to go out and get a headset of their own at the most. I made this video to put my feelings regarding Half-Life Alyx into a concrete medium, and I hope it gets how I feel about this game across to the viewer. I hope this video convinces those of you who haven't tried Half-Life Alyx for yourselves to give it a shot, and light a fire under the asses of those people who are able to get VR but think it isn't worth the monetary investment. Trust me, as the prices of VR headsets fall every day and the technology becomes more streamlined and convenient, you'll want to be there at the beginning of a new monolithic wave about to wash over the entertainment industry. Also, Valve, if you somehow see this video, thanks for coming back.